If you're watching this video, you're probably one of the few people lucky enough to have stumbled across Pantheon, an adult animated science fiction drama about the progress of technology and what it means to be human. If you haven't watched it, come back after you've repented your sins. It's one of the best animated shows ever made, easily on the levels of shows like Arcane and Avatar. Pantheon has a large cast of complex characters, but one that always stood out to me was Vinod Chanda. Chanda almost felt like a tertiary main character at times due to how isolated his story was from the rest of the casts. Villain arcs and redemption arcs are a tricky thing to write well, but Chanda stands as an excellent example of how to do them right. In order to analyse how Chanda went from a hopeful, mild-mannered engineer to a pessimistic terrorist, we have to first consider one of the most important themes of the show. Fundamentally, Pantheon asks what makes us human, and its conclusion on this question is that our humanity is derived from our relationships with other people. One of the most significant causes of Chanda's radicalization is how isolated and alone he is throughout the entire first season. He spends most of the season isolated from the rest of the cast, and even when he finally does meet up with them, he's seen as an outsider who isn't able to form relationships with them due to his extremist ideals. Over the course of the first season, Chanda becomes incredibly isolated from others and thus begins to lose his humanity. He doesn't care if innocent women and children die in the Alliance Telecom fire as long as he can get his revenge on Prasad, because he's got no one to bring him down to earth and quell his anger. This loneliness defines Chanda's character throughout season 1. When he calls his mother in episode 5, she says,
Your father and I always knew you'd struggle with making connections, being as intelligent and as hardworking as you are. There's no one like you.
previews describing the struggle of gifted children, but she is also unknowingly describing the struggle of UIs that Chanda is currently battling with. As far as Chanda knows, there really is no one like him, and as stated before, even when he does find David and Laurie, he still struggles to connect with them. This also causes him to justify these actions to himself in irrational ways and become frustrated when others question his logic. In regards to Prasad's murder, he says,
All right. It's not just a file. It was an action, and I regret it. And I've made that clear. I am not a murderer.
But he is a murderer, and his refusal to accept that fact makes this apology really hollow. Later in the show, David questions him about this, and Chanda's response is to immediately leave the server without responding. His time alone made him take actions that could only be justified by logic that cannot stand up to external scrutiny, so he chooses to isolate himself further and further until he's the only person whose opinion he has to care about. One of the other key aspects of Chanda's arc is the Messiah complex he develops over the course of the show. In his introductory scene, he's referred to as a prophet in regards to UI research, a line which is repeated during his monologue in episode 6. Quick side note, by the way, episode 6 actually uses a different take than the one that was used in the first episode for that line, which isn't really relevant, but I noticed it whilst gathering clips and I thought it was interesting.
You are a prophet, Chanda. You're a prophet, Chanda.
During his monologue, Chanda reveals that in his time alone, he sent the UI schematics to various world powers in hope of starting a digital arms race. When asked the very reasonable question of what on earth he was thinking when he did this, he says that it was the only way to ease people into the idea of UIs, the only way they could reveal themselves without being feared. He would be the one to get new UIs on side and be their messiah, because it's his destiny. It's what Prasad chose him for.
They'll send their soldiers out to war, but instead they'll meet me. And I will show them another way, another world where they can live in peace and freedom.
This scene is what cements Chanda as a revolutionary figure for UIs, an extremist willing to do whatever it takes for the good of his kind, because he believes that he is the only one with the strength or the will to do so. It also links this to his loneliness, making multiple references to how alone and overwhelmed he was in this new world. He wasn't just alone physically, he was alone in the sense that he believed he was the only living person to ever experience upload, that no one else could ever or would ever be able to understand. This mentality should have changed when he met David and Laurie, but by that stage he was in too deep. It would mean having to face the atrocities he'd committed with no way to excuse them. Chanda's arc throughout the first season is an excellent exploration of radicalism. In reality, people become radicalized because they're led to believe that they know better than everyone else, often due to recognizing problems in society that plague them and believing that they would know how to solve them. Extreme ideals that are viewed as unacceptable by society can only grow because of the loneliness of its victims, and cyclically, that loneliness creates an echo chamber to preserve the ideals. Radicalized people like Chanda can only be helped by breaking not only their sense of moral superiority, but by helping them become less lonely in order to weaken their internal echo chamber. And that is precisely the arc that the show takes Chanda on throughout season 2. Season 2 again has Chanda isolated from the rest of the main cast, stuck in the reign of Winter satellite uplink with Peng until he is freed by the newly uploaded Stephen Holstrom. Chanda's relationship to both of these characters informs the redemption arc the season takes him on. Peng is a Chinese UI who was imprisoned for speaking out against the state. He believes China has become capitalistic like the West and strayed from democratic centralism, a political movement that aspires for a dictatorship of the proletariat. When asked why he chose to upload to serve the party that imprisoned him, he says that he did it to serve his country, not the party. One of Peng's primary character traits is how he puts his principles above everything else, as he says when examining SafeSurf.
I choose principle over power, and I do not bow to that which seeks to crush me or my kind.
Chanda's response is,
I respect inspiration. This is inspired.
but they're not just referring to SafeSurf here, they're also talking about Holstrom. One of the main reasons Chanda chooses to betray Holstrom is that he starts to see the reason in Peng's worldview, principle over power. When Holstrom confronts Peng about leaking Caspian's identity, Chanda begs to spare him, claiming that he was scared and desperate. However, Peng denies this, standing by his principles, even when it will ultimately cost him his life. Immediately after this scene, Chanda betrays Holstrom by telling Ellen about his virus, despite great personal risk. It's worth asking why Chanda did this, as during the phone call he sounds concerned at the fact that Holstrom will kill millions to get what he wants, even though that's exactly what Chanda himself attempted to do in the Season 1 finale. Back in Season 1, Chanda said,
Why? They don't include you. They will never see you as the same.
in response to Laurie saying that she wants to save humans and UIs. But throughout the second season it quickly becomes clear that this is not the case. We see multiple examples of the concept of UIs beginning to be accepted by the general public, most notably Ellen's appearance on a talk show and when Maddie and Caspian are in London. Chanda spent a lot of time in Holstrom's world keeping up with the news and current events, so it would be clear to him now that humans are not as bad as he thought they would be. There's also the matter of SafeSurf. Its very existence means that beating humanity into submission is becoming increasingly impractical, and UIs now need the permission of humanity to be spared its wrath. Chanda believes that UIs are more than human, that they're gods who should be above petty squabbles and vengeance. However, this idea falls apart in episode 5 when Holstrom kills Peng for betraying him, cementing to Chanda that UIs are not above human depravity. They're far more similar to humans than he'd like to believe. It's also worth considering that throughout Season 1, UIs were essentially impervious to human attacks. They could only be killed by the Flaw or other UIs, but this all changed with SafeSurf. Now, humans have the equivalent of a nuclear bomb to use against UIs, which likely helped Chanda empathize with the fear he would have caused when he started firing nukes, and the fear Holstrom will cause with his virus. This is the surface-level reasoning the show gives for Chanda's redemption, but there's more to it than that. Chanda and Holstrom are very similar characters, both men who are socially isolated due to their intelligence, both willing to kill innocents for the greater good, and as Farhad Karimi puts it,
I know of you. As terrorists with no national loyalties.
Holstrom could easily be seen as a bad omen for Chanda, a warning of the man he would have become if he continued down the path of UI supremacy. It's appropriate, then, that Holstrom literally turns Chanda into a monster, with a demon-like appearance befitting of a man with his reputation. Chanda sees the true horror of the man he will become if he keeps going. This, alongside the murder of Peng, seem to be what finally convinces him to make a desperate attempt to make things right. Fighting against Holstrom means fighting against the world he sought to bring about, fighting against his future self manifest. He's finally able to come back down to earth and relate to human conflicts, which we can see when he tries to resolve Farhad and Yair's cultural conflict through peaceful means for the greater good. When he arrives to fight Holstrom, he states that he's fighting to save himself.
Myself!
This makes sense as he's seen the toll it would take to bring about his world, and standing up to Holstrom not only would symbolically represent his growth, but is also the only way to make up for what he's done. In the end, Chanda chooses his humanity over the grand scheme he was so obsessed with. When his attempt on Holstrom's life fails and he is left crippled and broken, he seems content. When Holstrom says,
Yours was always a borrowed dream, Vinod. A pity you couldn't remember that.
Chanda simply smiles, refusing to respond, content with knowing that he's risen above the man he once was before being unceremoniously killed. This acceptance of his fate also links back to how Ping took his own death with honor. He is not rewarded with a glorious death. He is instead rewarded by saving himself. Ping's steadfast resolve in the face of death taught Chanda to do the same when facing his own fate, to choose principles over power. In Season 1, Chanda was hopelessly alone. He began to think of himself as a messiah for UIs. Season 2 expertly undoes all of this by showing Chanda the worst version of himself in the form of Stephen Holstrom, shattering the illusion that he and the other UIs are above human depravity. But it also gives him a friend in Peng, someone who understands and trusts him, but also helps him grow by challenging his views and teaching him the value of the principles he forsook for vengeance. By choosing what is right instead of following the path of petty revenge, in his last moments, Chanda became the hero he once thought he was.